The Ultimatum arrived without ceremony, carried on a tight beam transmission that cut through every known channel and displayed itself on human screens from deep space relays to cracked phones in mining colonies, and it stated in flat, precise language that humanity would submit its governments, fleets, and industrial output to the authority of the unified Zaureth Compact within 70 standard hours or face systematic eradication. And when the message ended, there was no threat display, no show of force, because the aliens sending it did not believe one was needed. As far as they were concerned, this was paperwork before demolition, and across Earth and its scattered settlements the reaction was not panic but a long, tired silence that came from a species that had heard versions of this before in its own history, in boardrooms and battlefields and conquered cities. And in a secure room buried beneath old mountains, a small group of human leaders watched the playback again without speaking, including Admiral John Carter, whose hair had gone gray in wars no alien had bothered to study, Ambassador Ellen Brooks, who had spent her life being underestimated in rooms full of smiles, and systems engineer Daniel Price, who understood exactly what it meant when someone believed your extinction could be scheduled like maintenance. And Carter finally broke the silence by saying they did not send a fleet because they think we cannot hurt them, and Brooks replied that they sent a ultimatum to everyone because they want us afraid and divided. And Price quietly added that the 70 hours was not a deadline for surrender but a window for observation. They wanted to see if humans would beg, and that single observation shaped everything that followed because humanity did not respond at all. No rejection, no insult, no plea. The Compact waited for outrage or fear and received silence, while across human space orders went out through channels older than most colonies, not flashy or dramatic, just activation codes and confirmations. Fleets that officially did not exist changed course. Factories that claimed to produce civilian equipment shifted output without announcements. Data vaults that had been sealed since forgotten wars were opened by people who had sworn never to need them again. And in alien space, the Zaureth Compact Council congratulated itself on a clean process as analysts noted the lack of response as confirmation of psychological collapse. 1. Counselor remarked that humans were slower than projected, and another joked that maybe they were still translating, and they laughed because they had built their empire on the idea that every species reacted the same way to pressure, that fear led to submission or reckless attack, and neither worried them. While far from the council chambers, human strategists were not discussing defense of Earth at all but mapping supply routes, alliance fault lines, and historical grudges within the Compact itself. Because extinction-level strategy did not mean bigger bombs or louder fleets. It meant choosing to end the war before the enemy understood it had begun, and Carter sat with fleet captains on a secure link explaining that they were not to engage Compact forces directly unless ordered, that their role was to be seen in the wrong places at the wrong times, to be reported and dismissed. Brooks was already speaking with non-Compact species who had learned to survive by keeping their heads down, offering nothing dramatic, just asking careful questions about trade restrictions and patrol patterns. While Price led teams running simulations that assumed Earth would fall, colonies would burn, and billions would die, not because they believed it would happen, but because planning for extinction removed hesitation. It stripped the future down to essentials. And when 70 hours passed, the Compact sent a follow-up message stating that humanity had failed to comply and enforcement would begin. And this time the message was accompanied by the movement of fleets toward outer human systems, not toward Earth itself, but toward small settlements meant to be examples. And in the first hours of that advance, something strange happened as Compact logistics hubs began reporting delays caused by minor system failures. Nothing dramatic, navigation errors, power fluctuations, labor disputes among subject species who suddenly refused overtime, the kind of friction that empires expected and ignored. And when the first human colony was struck, the Compact declared it proof of superiority, broadcasting images of orbital bombardment to demonstrate resolve. But they missed the fact that the colony had been evacuated weeks earlier under the cover of routine resupply, and that the sensors they destroyed had already transmitted everything they needed. And as Compact fleets pushed deeper, they found human resistance inconsistent, sometimes absent, sometimes oddly precise. A single ship, appearing to fire one devastating salvo and then vanish, never staying to fight, never claiming victory, and council analysts began to argue, some saying humans were disorganized, others suggesting deception, but the majority believed this was a flailing of a species that knew it was outmatched, because they could not imagine a strategy that accepted losses without trying to stop them. They could not imagine a species choosing to look weak on purpose, and that blind spot was a core of the extinction-level strategy, because while the compact focus on conquest, humanity focused on strain, every move the aliens made was encouraged, redirected, or quietly made more expensive. Their fleets were lured into overextension, their subject worlds pushed closer to rebellion by subtle information leaks that suggested the compact was vulnerable, their supply lines stretched thin by human actions that looked like accidents. And when a junior compact officer finally reported that projected campaign costs were exceeding expectations, he was told that was normal for first contact exterminations and reassigned. And back on Earth, Carter watched casualty reports with a stone face, knowing every loss was buying time. Brooks listened as neutral species began asking what humans knew that made them so calm. And Price confirmed that compact command networks were now dependent on rerouted systems humans had quietly compromised years ago for reasons no one remembered, and still humanity did not announce anything, did not threaten, did not posture, because the ultimatum had never been about survival but about revealing how the enemy thought. And now they knew. The compact believed war was a demonstration of force leading to obedience, and humanity was preparing to demonstrate something else entirely, something that would not just defeat fleets but make the idea of issuing ultimatums to humans unthinkable. And as the first compact capital ships crossed the boundary where human space ended and theirs began, chasing targets that were meant to flee, the extinction-level strategy moved from preparation to execution, unseen, unannounced, and already too deep to stop. As the compact fleets advanced under the assumption that momentum itself was victory, the second phase unfolded in a way that looked, from the outside, like chaos rather than design, because human space began to fracture along lines that alien intelligence had already mapped and dismissed as weaknesses, independent colonies arguing with Earth, trade routes shutting down, local militias refusing compact demands in reckless gestures that got them annihilated, and council observers nodded along as reports painted a picture of a species eating itself under pressure. Yet beneath that noise the human response was tightening into something cold and deliberate, with Admiral John Carter authorizing operations that would never be recorded as battles and Ambassador Ellen Brooks quietly ensuring that no non-human power would later be able to claim ignorance of what the compact was doing. While Daniel Price and his teams began triggering dormant protocols embedded in systems the compact considered their own, not hacks or attacks in a dramatic sense, but subtle dependencies snapping one by one, so that fleet coordination lagged by seconds, then minutes, then entire jumps, and each delay forced compact commanders to make local decisions rather than rely on centralized doctrine, which was precisely what the humans wanted because compact doctrine was rigid and optimized for overwhelming compliance, not adaptive survival. And when a compact task force entered the Virex corridor expecting to intercept a fleeing human convoy, they instead found themselves trapped between gravity wells that human engineers had altered years earlier during joint infrastructure projects, causing jump miscalculations that scattered ships across light minutes of space, isolating them just long enough for small human strike groups to hit fuel depots and sensor arrays before vanishing again, never staying long enough to trigger decisive engagement. And reports of these incidents began to irritate the compact council because they did not fit the narrative of extermination, yet irritation was not alarm, as the council believed irritation was part of conquest, while on subject worlds rumors spread that human weapons could cripple compact ships without destroying them, that humans were choosing not to kill crews, that surrendering to humans meant survival. And these rumors were not invented but carefully encouraged by Brooks through deniable intermediaries who spoke only truths framed in the most destabilizing way possible, and soon compact security forces were spending as much effort suppressing unrest behind the lines as they were advancing forward, all while the human public was fed a version of events that emphasized endurance rather than victory, memorials rather than rallies, keeping expectations low and resolve steady, because extinction-level strategy demanded patience at a scale most species could not emotionally tolerate, and Carter understood that the real battle was not space but time. Every day the compact failed to achieve decisive compliance, their own internal metrics began to flag the campaign as inefficient, which in their political culture was more dangerous than defeat. Inefficiency bred blame, and blame fractured authority. And the fracture widened when a compact fleet near the Casas hub suffered a cascading system failure traced back to a maintenance update provided by compact subsidiary using human-written automation libraries licensed decades earlier. Libraries no one had audited because they worked perfectly until a specific set of conditions was met, conditions Price's team had just ensured existed, and the resulting paralysis allowed a single human cruiser to broadcast an open-channel message offering evacuation assistance to any ship that powered down weapons, a message that was recorded, replayed, and ridiculed by Compact Command until crews began accepting the offer anyway, choosing survival over doctrine, and when those crews were treated humanely and released through neutral space, the story spread faster than any official transmission, undermining the Compact's core myth that resistance to authority led only to annihilation, and still the Compact pressed forward, issuing harsher orders, accelerating timetables, because empires rarely slow down when their assumptions are challenged. They double down, and that acceleration played directly into the final preparations as human forces deliberately abandoned key positions, allowing Compact fleets to surge deeper, stretching supply lines to breaking while Earth remained conspicuously untouched, a fact some councilors questioned until reassured that saving Earth for last would maximize symbolic impact, and that decision sealed their fate because Earth was never the center of the human plan. It was the anchor, and as Compact forces committed nearly 70% of their mobile strength to the campaign, humanity triggered the next layer, not an attack, but a revelation, releasing evidence of Compact atrocities against subject species compiled over generations and cross-verified beyond denial, distributed through channels of Compact itself use of governance, forcing local administrators to confront the moral cost of obedience at the same moment their protectors were overextended. And revolts flared not as coordinated rebellions, but as thousands of small refusals that clogged the machinery of empire, ships delayed by dockworkers, troops rerouted to quell protests, resources diverted to internal security, and when Compact finally realized that the humans were not trying to win battles but collapse the system that made battles possible, it was too late to reverse course, because pulling back fleets would signal weakness and leaving them forward risked isolation, and in that paralysis humanity made its first unmistakable move. Not against a fleet or a world, but against a Compact strategic reserve, a hidden force meant to ensure dominance and existential threats, which humanity treated as just another variable already accounted for. And as alarms began to ring in council chambers that had never heard them before, the extinction-level strategy reached the point where survival was no longer the question, only how completely the galaxy would change once the Compact understood what it had awakened. The moment the Compact strategic reserve began to unravel was the moment the war stopped being a campaign and became a reckoning, because that reserve was not just ships and weapons, but the psychological backbone of their empire, the quiet assurance that no matter what went wrong, there was always a final force untouched and overwhelming. And when that force failed to mobilize on schedule due to cascading authorization conflicts, fuel shortages that should not have existed, and Command AIS returning contradictory threat assessments seeded months earlier by human analysts, the Council finally felt something close to fear, though they did not name it as such, instead calling emergency sessions to demand explanations while blaming each other for procedural failures. And as they argued, humanity moved with the calm of a species that had already accepted worst-case outcomes long ago, with Admiral John Carter authorizing what he referred to simply as closure operations, meaning that human fleets stopped retreating and started positioning themselves openly, not to attack but to block, appearing at choke points of Compact now desperately needed to withdraw through, while Ambassador Ellenbrooks addressed the galaxy in a broadcast that did not threaten or boast but laid out a simple record of events: the Ultimatum, the attacks on evacuated colonies, the documented abuses of subject worlds, and the human response, which he described not as retaliation but as containment, stating plainly that humanity had concluded the Compact was too dangerous to be allowed to continue operating as it had, and that this conclusion was not emotional but procedural, a risk assessment made after long study. And those words landed harder than any weapon because they stripped the Compact of its narrative of righteous authority, reframing it as a malfunctioning system scheduled for decommissioning. And within Compact space administrators began receiving contradictory orders as Central Command tried to reassert control while local leaders prioritized survival, some opening negotiations with nearby human forces without permission, others declaring independence outright, and Daniel Price monitored the data flows with grim satisfaction as thresholds were crossed one after another, points beyond which systems could not be restored without total shutdown, meaning the Compact could no longer coordinate empire-wide action even if the Council reached consensus. And when a senior Compact counselor finally demanded to know what humanity wanted, the answer was delivered not by diplomats but by consequences, as the Strategic Reserve's flagship emerged from jump only to find its navigation grid rewritten, forcing it into a holding orbit where it was surrounded by human vessels that did not fire but transmitted a single message offering safe escort out of Compact space in exchange for deactivation, an offer that was accepted after hours of silence, and that acceptance echoed across the galaxy as undeniable proof that the compact's ultimate deterrent had chosen compliance, and with that the extinction-level strategy reached its final phase, not annihilation but replacement, as humans moved to stabilize trade routes, protect worlds in open revolt, and dismantle compact institutions with methodical precision, refusing to occupy worlds or claim territory, instead insisting on local governance backed by mutual defense agreements. And Carter noted privately that the galaxy would remember this not as a day humanity conquered an empire, but as a day an empire collapsed because it tried to intimidate the wrong species, while Brooks prepared for years of negotiation ahead, knowing peace was always harder than war. And Price archived the operation under a simple designation meaning resolved threat, because from a human perspective the ultimatum had been answered the only way it ever could be, by making sure no one in the future would ever think issuing another one with a viable option. And as a remnant of the compact retreated into irrelevance, the broader galaxy adjusted to a new reality, one where humanity was no longer underestimated, not because it was loud or cruel, but because it had demonstrated that when pushed toward extinction it did not panic or rage. It planned, patiently, quietly, and without mercy for broken systems that endangered everyone else. In the long shadow that followed the compact's collapse, the galaxy did not settle into peace so much as into recalibration, because systems that had existed for centuries were suddenly gone, and the silence they left behind forced every civilization to confront questions they had avoided under imperial order, and humanity found itself at the center of that recalibration, whether it wanted the role or not, with Admiral John Carter spending his days arbitrating disputes between former compact sectors whose borders had only ever been administrative conveniences, now hardened into potential fault lines, while human fleets remained present but deliberately restrained, visible enough to deter opportunists yet distant enough to avoid looking like occupiers, a balance Carter understood instinctively because he had studied human history where liberation too easily slid into control. And Ambassador Ellen Brooks became the face of a new kind of authority that refused to call itself leadership, speaking in assemblies where dozens of species argued over trade rights, security guarantees, and the meaning of sovereignty without an empire to define it for them. And Brooks never promised safety or prosperity, only transparency and consequence, explaining that humanity would enforce agreement it signed and would ignore appeals that tried to turn humans into a replacement compact. A stance that frustrated many but slowly built trust because it was consistent, while Daniel Price and his engineers shifted from dismantling hostile systems to helping rebuild neutral ones, openly sharing methodologies that allowed local worlds to audit and control their own infrastructure rather than depend on distant powers. And this openness unsettled many galactic elites who had relied on complexity as a form of control, because humans treated knowledge as a stabilizing force rather than leverage. And yet beneath this surface of cooperation there was tension, because not everyone saw the compact's fall as liberation. Some species had prospered under its rule, others feared the chaos of self-determination, and a few ambitious powers began quietly testing the limits of human resolve, probing patrol routes, violating minor accords, spreading narratives that humanity's restraint was weakness, and Carter tracked these incidents with weary familiarity, knowing that history repeated itself not through grand cycles but through small predictable patterns. And when a coalition of former compact militarists attempted to seize control of a key shipyard claiming to restore order, humanity responded swiftly but narrowly, disabling the coup without expanding its footprint, arresting leaders and turning them over to local courts, a move that sent a clear signal that humans would intervene to stop domination but would not dictate outcomes. And this approach slowly reshaped galactic norms as more worlds realized that appealing to humanity required responsibility rather than submission. And in private conversations, Brooks admitted that this was the hardest part, teaching the galaxy rays under ultimatums to function without them, while Price warned that fragments of compact ideologies still lingered in data networks and institutional habits, capable of re-emerging if left unchallenged, prompting humanity to invest in long-term cultural exchange rather than surveillance, an approach some human politicians questioned until Carter reminded them that extinction-level strategy was not about destruction, but about preventing recurrence, and preventing recurrence meant changing incentives rather than policing endlessly. And years later, when historians would try to pinpoint the moment the galaxy truly changed, many would argue it was not the day the ultimatum was answered or the reserve surrendered, but this quieter period when humanity chose patience over dominance, proving that its greatest weapon was not fleets or plans, but the refusal to become what it had just dismantled, a refusal that made the lesson permanent. Because the galaxy learned not only that humanity could end an empire, but that it would not replace one, and that combination made humans something far more unsettling than conquerors. It made them a standard against which all future powers would be judged, whether they wanted that judgment or not. The passage of time did not dull the impact of what humanity had done, but sharpened it, because as decades unfolded, the absence of a single dominating empire forced civilizations to confront one another as equals or adversaries without an intermediary to absorb the blame. And in that environment, human influence became less visible yet more pervasive. With Admiral John Carter eventually retiring from active command only to find his doctrines taught in foreign academies that studied restraint as a strategic principle, a concept previously dismissed as weakness, while Ambassador Ellenbrook spent years traveling between systems where her presence alone shifted negotiations, not because she threatened force, but because everyone knew that behind her calm words stood a species that had already demonstrated it would act decisively if systemic abuse re-emerged. And Daniel Price oversaw the quiet standardization of open infrastructure frameworks that allowed even small worlds to manage defense and trade without surrendering autonomy, a legacy that outlived any single treaty. And yet the galaxy was not naive enough to believe history was finished, because new powers rose from the ruins of the compact, some cooperative, some hostile, all shaped by the lesson of the Ultimatum. And when a rising coalition attempted to pressure fringe human colonies with economic blockades and veiled threats, expecting Earth to negotiate from a position of appeasement, the response was immediate and eerily familiar. No speeches, no mobilization announcements, just a sudden reconfiguration of trade routes, mutual defense clauses quietly activated, and the coalition's leverage evaporated as partners withdrew rather than risk association, and observers realized with a chill that extinction-level strategy was no longer a one-time response but a standing posture, a way of thinking embedded into human policy that treated coercion as a system failure to be corrected rather than a challenge, to be met head-on. And this realization reshaped diplomacy as species learned that dealing with humanity required sincerity, because deception and intimidation triggered processes far beyond simple retaliation. And Carter once summarized it bluntly to a young officer by saying that humans had learned the hard way that the safest galaxy was one where no one believed ultimatums worked. And as that belief spread, the memory of the compact faded into cautionary tale, its ruins studied not for their power but for their blind spots. And in the quiet stability that followed, humanity did not celebrate or commemorate its victory with monuments, because from its perspective the real success was invisible, a galaxy where threats were weighed carefully before spoken, where dominance was suspect, and where extinction was no longer considered an acceptable bargaining chip. All because one species had answered an ultimatum not with fury or surrender, but with a strategy that made issuing such demands obsolete forever. Even with the outward calm that followed humanity's rise as an unspoken stabilizing force, there remained undercurrents of unease that never fully disappeared, because the galaxy had learned restraint but not wisdom, and restraint without understanding could fray under pressure, a fact that became clear when long-range sensors detected coordinated military exercises by a distant power block that had deliberately stayed neutral during the compact era, and now believed the post-compact order had grown complacent. And while public statements framed the maneuvers as defensive training, the scale and positioning told a different story that Admiral John Carter, now older and officially removed from command, recognized instantly when briefed as an advisor, noting that it was the same probing behavior that preceded every major conflict in human history, the testing of assumptions. And Earth's response followed a familiar pattern that had become second nature: no condemnation, no mobilization speeches, just a quiet recalculation of probabilities and the activation of layers that most of the galaxy had forgotten existed, with Ambassador Ellenbrook reaching out to allied and neutral worlds not to warn them but to share verified data about the exercises, letting transparency do the work of persuasion, while Daniel Price supervised the adaptation of extinction-level strategy principles to a purely deterrent framework that focused on making escalation irrational before it could begin. And as trade networks subtly shifted and cooperative defense agreements refreshed themselves through automated consensus protocols, the power block discovered that its planned show of strength was isolating it faster than any human threat ever could, partners backing away, insurers raising rates, internal factions questioning leadership, and when its diplomats finally approached humanity seeking clarification, they were met with a response that was almost disappointingly simple. A statement that humans had no objection to training or defense, but would respond decisively to any attempt at coercion or expansion, not as punishment but as correction, a phrasing that unsettled the bloc's leaders because it implied inevitability rather than negotiation. And within weeks the exercises were scaled back, quietly rebranded, and eventually cancelled. Not because of fear of immediate destruction, but because the system had already begun to turn against the behavior that enabled them, reinforcing the lesson that humanity's greatest influence lay not in what it threatened to do, but in how thoroughly it had redefined the cost of aggression. And among historians and strategists, this period became known as the era of silent deterrence, where wars were prevented not by standoffs, but by preemptive collapse of incentives. And Carter would later reflect that the extinction-level strategy had evolved into something almost philosophical, a commitment to ensuring that no single actor could ever again believe the galaxy itself was a prize to be claimed. And as younger generations across multiple species grew up in this environment, learning history that framed the compact not as a villain but as a warning about systems that mistake obedience for stability, the final echo of the original ultimatum faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding shared across worlds that humanity did not need to shout its power because the galaxy had already learned to listen. By the time the generation that remembered the compact firsthand began to age out of power, the extinction-level strategy had fully transformed from a contingency plan into a cultural reflex embedded deep within human decision-making, and that reflex was tested hardest not by external threats but by internal debate. Because a growing number of human worlds questioned whether carrying the weight of galactic stability was worth the cost, arguing that humanity had earned the right to step back, to be just another civilization among many. And those arguments reached their peak when a severe economic downturn struck several core human systems at once, forcing leaders to choose between domestic recovery and continued investment in interstellar security frameworks that mostly benefited others. And it was in this moment of vulnerability that a coalition of mid-tier powers attempted something subtler than conquest, proposing a restructuring of galactic governance that on the surface promised efficiency and fairness, but in practice concentrated authority into a council where humanity will be bound by collective vetoes, effectively neutralizing its ability to act unilaterally. And the proposal was elegant, legal, and dangerous, because it sought to achieve through bureaucracy what the compact had failed to achieve through force. And when the debate erupted across human space, it was more divisive than any alien fleet had ever been, with citizens arguing whether refusing the proposal would paint humanity as hypocrites who dismantled one empire only to block cooperation, while supporters warned that accepting it would recreate the very dynamics that led to oppression. And Admiral John Carter, long retired and rarely public, broke his silence with a simple address that avoided rhetoric and focused on structure, explaining that the danger was not shared governance but irreversible delegation of enforcement power, reminding listeners that systems fail not when intentions are bad but when correction becomes impossible. And Ambassador Ellen Brooks followed with a quiet but devastating analysis presented to the proposing coalition, walking them through historical examples from multiple species where centralized authority without exit mechanisms inevitably led to ultimatums, not because leaders were evil but because systems under stress defaulted to coercion. And Daniel Price provided the technical proof by modeling how the proposed governance algorithms would respond to resource scarcity, demonstrating that within predictable parameters the system would always favor enforcement over reform. And faced with this unified response, the coalition withdrew the proposal, publicly citing technical concerns, but privately acknowledging that humanity had seen through it faster than expected. And among the broader galaxy, the incident reinforced a deeper realization that humans were not merely reacting to threats but actively guarding against structural conditions that made threats likely, and that this vigilance extended inward as much as outward, because humanity was willing to argue with itself as fiercely as it would oppose any empire. And as recovery took hold and the crisis passed, the galaxy observed something rare, a dominant stabilizing power choosing not to entrench itself further, but instead refining the rules that limited its own reach, a move that confused traditional strategists but resonated deeply with worlds that had lived under absolute control. And slowly the extinction-level strategy completed its final evolution, no longer a plan for survival or deterrence, but a shared galactic norm that treated irreversible power as a true existential risk, a lesson paid for in fear, patience, and loss, and one that ensured that the original ultimatum would remain not just unanswered, but unrepeatable. When the last archival review of the compact era was finally sealed and classified as settled history, the galaxy reached a point that no strategist had ever seriously planned for, a long, stable equilibrium where no single power could issue an ultimatum without triggering collective resistance before the words even finished transmitting, and humanity found itself quietly stepping back not into isolation but into normalcy, a position it had not held since the stars first learned its name, with Admiral John Carter passing away on a quiet world far from capitals, his doctrine so ingrained that no one thought to credit him anymore, Ambassador Ellen Brooks retiring after decades of negotiation to teach future diplomats how to recognize coercion before it hardened into policy, and Daniel Price watching younger engineers from dozens of species improve upon systems he had once designed in secrecy. And in that handoff lay the true conclusion of the extinction-level strategy, because it had never been meant to last forever as a human advantage, but to burn itself out by changing the environment that made it necessary. And generations later, when students across the galaxy studied the moment that reshaped interstellar relations, they did not focus on battles or fleets, but on the psychology of the ultimatum itself, how the compact had assumed fear was universal and compliance inevitable, and how humanity had responded not by disproving that assumption with brute force, but by exposing its consequences so completely that no rational actor would repeat it. And this understanding reshaped culture as much as politics, with stories, ethics, and even language evolving to treat existential threats as failures of imagination rather than tools of negotiation. And in human space, the event faded into myth not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined identity, becoming one chapter in a much longer story of a species that had survived its own darkest impulses before, confronting those of others. And on rare occasions, when distant civilizations first reached the galactic stage and asked older powers what they should know about humanity, the answer was no longer about fleets or weapons or strategies, but a simple caution passed down like folklore, that humans were the ones who ended the age of ultimatums, not by shouting louder, but by answering one so completely that the galaxy learned never to ask again. And in that quiet, enduring lesson, the war truly ended. Not with surrender or celebration, but with a shared understanding that extinction was no longer a bargaining position, because one species had shown exactly what it cost to try.